Welcome everybody to the North Carolina VIPER radio training. This is the healthcare module for hospitals 2022 update. My name is Matt McMahon. I'm a disaster and communication specialist with the Eastern Healthcare Preparedness Coalition. And I'd like to welcome you today, and I appreciate your time. This should last about a half hour. We don't intend it to make it too long, just enough for you to get the most important information. You'll see a variety of agencies listed on your screen, and through North Carolina Emergency Management, TSU, Office of EMS. We've had input from all those agencies, and we want to make sure this information was accurate and up to date that we're presenting to you. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is the new VIPER template and the update and time frame in which all that is supposed to occur. We're going to talk about the 2025 TDMA VIPER upgrade. Probably been a lot of talk about that lately. Review on the equipment that's still being used in healthcare facilities, and take a look at some of the newer equipment. And review basic functionality of VIPER desk sets. So kind of the nuts and bolts of what you really need to know about the radios in the hospital. And then what are the need to know items for VIPER as it relates to hospitals. So those are some of the items we'll take a look at today. There is some supplemental training. We did do a longer detailed summary of VIPER and some of the radio functions, and it goes into a little bit deeper dive, but the link is included here in the presentation. It's about an hour and a half, so if you want more information, you definitely can take a look at that. And here's a list of some of the other ones that's going to be coming up soon. We're going to do one specifically for aviation, search and rescue, auxiliary communications. This is one here that you probably want to pay attention to, the PACE planning. That'll be important, especially for hospitals and healthcare facilities. We hope to have that out by hurricane season 2022. And we'll do a short one on communication resources in North Carolina, what's available to you, and of course documentation, which can become important. All right, so disclaimer, this is pretty generic, but VIPER is a Motorola P25 Phase 1 trunked radio system. So any mention that we have in the presentation of a particular vendor does not necessarily mean that's the sole vendor we are supporting. VIPER does have an approved radio list of the radios that can be used on the system. A majority of the radios are Motorola, so that's why we're going to cover mainly the radios that are in hospitals. And the pictures of the radios and other things in the training slides are the most common platforms, and they're open source. So obviously if you have different equipment, please refer to your hardware manual for further information. That being said, most of the things we're going to discuss today is pretty general across a lot of the radios. All right, so the first big topic here, this is the minimum required VIPER template. And this document here we'll have online where you can reference it. And this document was developed by the Statewide Interoperability Executive Committee. And this is the first document of its kind in North Carolina that kind of explains what the base template is and what those channels are used for. This was created by the SIEC in 2021. And it was updated with to include new channels, and there were some modifications of some existing ones, and also some were deleted. They added some guidance with encryption, some programming authority, who actually has the authority to program, and some little bit of strategy on how they're going to use the statewide event talk groups. We're not going to take a deep look at this. We took a deep look on the general presentation, so if you want more information and actually some explanations on that, feel free to take a look at the main VIPER presentation. But the link will be available when we publish this presentation. All right, so what what radio resources are still active in hospitals? What do you have? And the answer is it varies across the state. But for the most part, every hospital has VIPER. Every hospital, unless they have removed it, probably still has VHF, which is what we call the old patient call-in. We used to call it 340, but it's 155, 340 megahertz. And what that's a direct radio to radio, so there's no infrastructure there. So it's limited on range. So if an ambulance is out in the field, within 5-10 miles, they probably can make contact. But if you're a good distance away, that obviously does not work. One disadvantage with that, every county in North Carolina had their own PL or private line tone, which is kind of a private tone that's inaudible. And you had to have that tone enabled if you wanted to actually talk to a hospital in a different county. And that kind of complicated radio programming for some folks. But for the most part, that's still in a lot of the hospitals, and we consider that a backup. Satellite telephones. There are some hospitals that do have satellite telephones, and I challenge the ones that do to regularly test those. That's probably the biggest gap, is have the hardware but hasn't been updated or hasn't been tested. Of course, landline phones, that's a perfectly acceptable form of communication. Cellular telephones, and that's a very convenient way, especially in the healthcare field, to relay information. And just a note, cell phones are pretty convenient, but they are not to be considered the primary method of patient reporting and contact in hospitals. They are a convenient method. So a lot of times in disasters, we do have cellular impacts. So that's why we have radios to start with. And then amateur radio, or what we call AUXCOM, auxiliary communications. So at a lot of hospitals, there are some AUXCOM resources, whether it's hardware or personnel to support that hardware. And that varies across the state. All right, so handheld radios. Some hospitals may have handheld radios, which are really good. We do recommend that. In the event the hospital is displaced or the ER is displaced, you can still maintain operations with a portable radio if you have to set shop up in a different part of the hospital, etc. So it's very good to have a portable. We're not going to cover the functions of a portable in this presentation. If you want more information, the link is included right here, and it'll take you to that main PowerPoint, and it'll go in depth about what the functions of most of the radios are on VIPER. All right, so this is probably what you're most familiar with. This is the MCD 3000 and MCD 5000, and that it's the old one on the left, new one on the right. And this, a little bit of history, is the state of North Carolina Office of EMS initially transferred and installed all of these VIPER Medical Network desk sets in a lot of the emergency departments. And that's what you see, this MCD 3000. So most of them are approaching 10, 15 years old by now, and are starting to fail, and we'll talk more about that for 2025. But this is the mainstay of what you see in North Carolina hospitals right here. There are some that have progressed over to the MCD 5000, which is the replacement. It's the newer model, and we'll kind of take a deep look here at those. So the 3000, they are the older Astro 25 series radios. So these are going to work up to the 2025 deadline of when VIPER switches over to the new technology, and then you will have to use one of the newer style radios. Some hospitals have chosen different vendors, so there's been a few across different parts of the state have already replaced them, and they've replaced them with different style radios, which that's what's great about P25 and VIPER, is that there's a whole lot of options there. So this is a look of the the MCD 3000, what it looks like on the screen. Very simple. If you just look at it, you see the screen. It has a VMJ with some numbers after it and some buttons, zone up, zone down, and some other ones. A lot of them are blank. We'll take a look at those in a second. So let's talk about the layout here. So what we have are things called zones, and we have talk groups. And basically zones are sections of talk groups that are bunched together. So generally we have 16 channels or talk groups that are in each zone. And it's kind of unique. You might ask, why is this channel called VMJ 59101? It doesn't tell me a whole lot. I don't know what the name of that talk group is. And that's a valid point, but where that came from is back the older UHF med system in North Carolina. You actually had to dial a touch tone keypad, and when you dialed that, it was actually that number there. So 59101 was a hospital, and so they just kept that as VIPER came along, and that older med UHF system was phased out. So as of right now, they've just chose to keep that same path. So when you're looking at some of these templates and you say, well, who is VMJ 59101? It's a great question. So we'll give you some answers and some solutions to that here in just a few minutes. But when we look at that on the screen, you'll see VMJ. That stands for the zone. So it's VIPER Medical Network. That's VMN. It's the J part of the zone. And then the talk group is actually 59101. And it's kind of hard to see this on the right. This is pretty small, but what you see across the top black header, those are the zone names, and then you see channel names that all fall below that. So channels, when we say channels, it's the same thing as talk groups. So talk groups are essentially virtual channels in the trunking world. All right, so another look here, and it kind of shows you on the right hand side. So we see VMJ, and of course these are different zones pictured, but those are the zones across the top right there. And if we look at the next slide, we see then we see all the talk groups that are laid out. So obviously the 59101 is the talk group, and what you see here, this button, even though it doesn't say channel, the arrow up and the arrow down, that's actually how we switch channels in the zone. So that's how we move up and down. And I want to go back to the zone right here. So what I did skip over is you see this zone up, zone down. So when you hit zone up and zone down, you traverse across the header of zones here. So when you say zone up, you would move this way, and you'd be moving through the zones. And same thing where we got to the talk group, as you talk group up, talk group down, that's how you would be moving through the actual zone between the talk groups. All right, the other big thing you need to know is it's pretty rare that you switch channels from the hospital standpoint. Most of the time a hospital radio is an inbound only form of communication. That radio is sitting there and it's waiting for EMS and helicopters and everything else to call the hospital with patient reports. So it's pretty rare the channel moves. But we find a lot, either somebody's testing, doing something with the radio, and maybe it gets off on the wrong channel. Well, as long as the radio is programmed correctly, if you hit the menu/home button and you hold that down, what it means is home. And it should take you back to your home agency talk group. So if you got off a few zones and you're like, wow, I totally forget how to get back to what our hospital talk group is, just hold that home button down and it'll take you back. On the newer radios, you'll actually see, even on the older portables, you'll see a little house symbol. And if you ever see that, what that means is home. So it'll take you back to your home talk group. All right, so moving into the MCD 5000, this is the newer style. This one looks a little bit more complicated. and it actually it is, unfortunately, but it's the standard replacement for the older 3000. You can connect this either over the internet or with a straight cable to where the radio is. And if you notice on the bottom right hand side of the screen, this is your push to talk button, very similar to the 3000, which is a red button. So you don't have to pick this handset up to use this. You can just push this button here, and the microphone is in this area here, and you could talk in a normal voice, and everything works just fine. Most of the common issues with any of these desk set radios is the volume is not turned up. So maybe it was getting on somebody's nerve, and we turned the volume down and forgot to turn it back up. Not being on the correct channel, so somebody's messed with it. Maybe they've hit a button and it sits there until basically you get a complaint and say, hey, we were calling you on the radio, nobody picked up. Or that sometimes with this newer radio, depending upon how it's set up, you will actually have to log into the desk set to connect to the actual radio itself, and sometimes that gets kind of aggravating, and we can help with that. There's some cheat sheets. But looking at this here, we'll just go over the few buttons. So we have a home button, see the little house there. We have the transmit button. We have the volume button. And then here's our channel button, actually says channel. And then we have some LED lights here for transmit, busy, and if we're receiving. And if you notice these buttons here, these are the menu soft key buttons. Okay, so up through the top and through the bottom. While we're here, this handset, you can pick the handset up and you can listen just like a normal telephone set through the receiver, and there's actually a transmit button on the other side of this. So when you get ready to transmit, you just squeeze the button and talk into it. And somebody said, well, why do I need this? I just push the button and use this. Well, maybe there's a circumstance that you don't want everybody to hear the radio traffic that you're about to receive. And in that case, you can make it a little more private, pull the handset up, and just use this as you would a normal telephone. 90% of the time, folks don't use it. All right, a little closer look at the screen here. This is very similar to the Apex newer style Motorola radio. So you'll see the soft buttons here. If we wanted to switch zones, so you remember earlier that there was an actual zone up, zone down button. So here it's a little bit different. It's a soft key, so we would click zone, and then we would use our arrows to scroll left, scroll right to the zone that we wanted to get to. Another one is the Receive Signal Strength Indicator, RSSI. So if maybe we're having communication difficulty, that's a button we want to hit that, and it'll tell us if the radio does have good connectivity into the site. Generally, we tell people we really want it over 55, but it can work lower. But generally, everything should be at least 55 as a general rule of thumb. And there's your channel button, and that's about it. So all these keys here, these soft keys, this is just an example of a possible setup. There is no standard on how these buttons here are programmed. It's up to the vendor and how the customer wants this programmed. But for the most part, you'll see the zone button entered right here. All right, so real quick talking about patient reports over the radio. This comes up a lot, and we actually get a lot of phone calls and for all sorts of different things. But I want to remind everybody that all communications on VIPER, on the VMN talk groups going to hospitals, is in the clear. So what that means is it's not encrypted. It's in the open. Anybody with a scanner can be listening to it. So generally, no PHI or no protected health information should be shared across VIPER. Now, that being said, it gets into a gray area, and we sure won't get into it here. But the average dispatch is to a 54-year-old female, chest pain with an address. And that is not a HIPAA violation, because that certain amount of information has to be given out on dispatch, and it gets into a little bit of a gray area. But so that's why when we call patient reports in, it's we're en route with a 54-year-old female. Chief complaint is chest pain, because that's the same information that's being given out in the clear over dispatch. So that being said, we'll talk a little bit here as we get further down. There are some cases where we may want to send a little more information to the hospital. But just so we know, every hospital in North Carolina has its own assigned VMN VIPER talk group. Okay, so I can tell you from traveling across the United States, North Carolina is extremely lucky to have VIPER, and also to have every hospital have its own talk group. So I can reach out to any hospital in North Carolina and talk to them. All right, so patient call-in reports will vary by location. So we see everything from a 10-second patient report all the way up to a life story. So the general rules of thumb: make it short. It's age, sex, chief complaint, the interventions that you've done, and how long is it going to be till you get there. Make sure you share any of the essential alert information. So if your hospital or jurisdiction has STEMI, stroke, trauma protocols, obviously make sure you're following those. And some prefer calling in on a cellular phone if PHI has to be shared. But so make sure you work that stuff out. But this is just general rules of thumb here. We really don't want a life story shared over VIPER about the patient. So this is really pertinent information. Okay, so I'll let this screen stay up here for a second. This is the VIPER Medical Network reference, and what you see is this reference document. The link is included. You can do a Google search on this, and we'll include a link with the presentation when we publish it. But feel free to look that up. There's a wealth of information in there. And the QR code that you see on the right, what that is your actual VMN talk group channel list. That's pretty convenient. So take a look at that QR code. You can scan it with your phone even right now while you're watching the presentation and download that document. All right, so some things you need to know about VIPER. And these are things you probably have not heard before. So there's a few things we need to discuss if it ever occurs, what the proper procedure is. So the first one is called a system busy. And what it means is, VIPER is a large connection of radio sites that's a big spider web. And at each one of those radio sites, there's a certain amount of resources that can handle the usage in that area. And occasionally there may be a lot going on in that area, and occasionally the site will run out of resources. Basically, there's not enough radios to handle all the traffic. So what happens is the site actually, when you try to push the button, the site will say, hey, I'm totally maxed out, I'm busy, and it's going to send you a sound, and it's going to sound just like this. All right, so it may have been a while since you've heard it on a telephone, but that is a somewhat of a busy sound. Okay, so I want you to remember what that sounds like, because what happens is when you get a busy, it places you into a queue. And you don't have to do anything else. You just sit there and wait, and when that next channel comes open for you to use, your radio will get a talk permit tone, and then you can go ahead and send the traffic that you needed to. What you don't need to do is to continuously push the button, thinking the radio's not working, or turn the radio off, thinking it's not working, turn it back on. Because what happens with that is you get placed in a queue, and that queue keeps growing. And then it actually can get out of control, because then other people are starting to experience it, and then they're turning their radio off back on, and then that queue is just getting much longer. So if you do get a busy signal, it should be rare, but it's okay. You may just have to wait a second before you can send your message. All right, the next one is site trunking. And we didn't go really into the nuts and bolts of how VIPER works in this presentation, but the moral of the story is what you see on the right, is we have radio sites, and in between these radio sites we have connections, and most of them are microwave connections. So all of these sites are connected together, and if we have some type of either maintenance, or maybe there's an event, something's gone wrong, one of these sites may go into what we call site trunking mode. So the site continues to work fine, but it's knocked off from the rest of the network and the towers across the state. And you'll also, if the radio is programmed to do it, you'll get a sound that sounds like this. Yeah, and the radio will actually just keep making that sound, and it'll display site trunking on the screen. So what that tells you is, hey, the radio site is working, but it's not connected into the rest of the sites. So there are some caveats that you need to be aware. So if you are talking to a dispatch center that maybe only is core connected actually into the system itself, that you may not be able to talk to them. But from the hospital standpoint, what happens is the radio goes to the local site, and you may get some missed traffic. So if an ambulance is coming, let's say from this side over here, maybe from a county next door, and they're using this site, there may be a chance that that traffic is not going to make it to you. But locally, you still should be able to maintain communications. There is a button. Remember what we talked about earlier, the RSSI? Well, a lot of times if we hold that button down, it's what we call site scan. And what it does is it forces the radio to look at these other radio sites here and say, hey, can I get to anywhere else? But a lot of times all that's done automatically, but that is available for you to use. And that's what's listed here. So attempt to force the radio to move to an adjacent site, called the site scan feature. And if this, most of the time the TSU or the Network Operations Center will know that this is occurring. But this is, if you're a hospital and you're getting these site trunking alarms, your first point of contact would be either the county emergency manager, or perhaps the Healthcare Coalition, or OEMS. And then those points of contact will check with the VIPER TSU and see. Just make sure they're aware. All right, so here's some other things, sounds. We call it the beeps, sweeps, and creeps. So here's what you see are stars. These are the common ones. So a button press will get a beep. Low battery, that's only when we're talking about handhelds. Out of range, it's possible you may hear that. So if you have an antenna that either breaks, or maybe a site goes down completely and you can't get to another site, you may get an out of range sound. Prohibit, okay, so I'll show you what that sounds like. System busy, we talked about that. And talk permit. All right, so here's the talk permit tone. So anytime you push the button to talk, that's what we call a talk permit tone. And what that means is the radio has completed a handshake with the system. The system recognizes your radio, recognizes the ID and the talk group that you're on, and says, you're good, go ahead. So it's important that talk permit tone, anything you say before that tone is finished, the other party or the other end is not going to hear. So make sure you wait until that talk permit tone is completed and then send your message. All right, the next one is what we call a denial or prohibit, and in simple terms we call it a bonk. Okay, so a lot of things, all I get is a bonk. Well, this is what that sounds like. Pretty obvious. And that's what we call a bonk. And what that means is, hey, the radio is trying to reach out to the system. The system is either denying me, or I can't hear it, and it's letting you know you can't talk. All right, system busy. And again, that one I'll play it. We've already played it once. Oh, that was actually talk permit tone. How do you like that? So that gives you an idea. So we talked about talk permit tone. In the previous slide, we talked about a system busy. And here we have a denial, a prohibit, or a no service, a bonk. All right, the next thing you need to know is what we call responsible monitoring. And from the hospital standpoint, this really isn't an issue. This is usually at the end subscriber level. When we have a big disaster and folks are trying to, I hate to call sandbag, they're trying to listen to something going on. Maybe there's been a large plane crash in the north part of the state and everybody wants to hear the operation. Well, just know when you're listening to the system, VIPER, the system itself, has to use resources to get that traffic from wherever it's occurring to you. Okay, so that's bad if it's a widespread disaster, especially if you're not involved with the incident. So there's something behind the scenes they call it all start. And what it means is when one site has traffic, it looks to all the other sites in the state that need to hear that traffic. And if one of those sites can't take the traffic because it's busy, maybe all those resources are tied up, it basically discards it, holds it. Okay, so that you may, just by the very fact of listening to an operation, may affect the actual operation itself. Okay, so responsible monitoring is if you're not involved with the incident directly, you don't need to be listening to it. Again, not a big deal on the hospital side, but it's worth mentioning. All right, so the largest gaps on the healthcare side of the house. So the first one is generally the hospital radios stay on their home channel. Probably 98% of their life, it stays on that talk group or channel and never moves. So one downfall with that is the end user familiarity with all the other channels that are in that radio. So for example, if your hospital loses all communications, and VIPER traditionally is pretty resilient because it uses a microwave backhaul. It doesn't use third-party vendors and carriers to move the traffic. And so we've had a few hospitals that have lost internet 100%. And unfortunately, the cell carriers that were around those hospitals also used that same internet connection. So there are times the VIPER radio may be the only thing that you have to talk to the outside world. And it's very important that you know how to navigate through all the channels in that radio. And most of them have at least over 1,000 channels. That's a lot of channels. So having a channel list, or what we call a fleet map, is really important to have. And then ask the users of the radio, hey, I need you to go to this channel. Can you show me how to do it? And see, and practice and see if they know how to do it. The next one is repair and service. So if I have a problem with this radio, who do I call? And just so we can clear it up, the radios that are in every hospital were provided by the state, back in probably 10, 15 years ago, and were transferred to the facilities. And it's up to that facility to maintain that equipment, and when the time comes when it needs to be replaced, it's your job to replace it. And so a lot of times it'll go years without anybody knowing. There'll be personnel change, and somebody new will come in and say, well, whose radio is this? Who do I need to call? So making sure you got contact with, you stay in contact with your healthcare coalition, your radio vendor. So, if the antenna gets blown over, the coax or the feed line goes bad, it's not working, who do you call? And those are very important things to know. And we cannot recommend a vendor. There is a main one in North Carolina. Of course, different manufacturers have different vendors. But you can always reach out to your healthcare coalition and they can guide you in the right direction. Another one is a disparate systems. So there's still VHF 340, and there are some EMS and healthcare workers agencies, convalescent transports that may not have VIPER. They may only have 340 that you may still get traffic on. And of course, some hospitals around larger municipalities have private systems. So they may be accustomed for a majority of their local EMS traffic comes from a different system than VIPER. So that's just keep that in mind. Is there still are some systems being used, outside of VIPER. The other one is PACE plans, and we're going to have a module specifically to PACE plans, but it's very important. So PACE, we'll talk about it, is primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. So what that means is it's plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. And it relates to technology, not so much the specific solution. So if my internet fails or my local telephones fail, what's my next option? And that's the same thing. And that's where we want to make sure that you incorporate VIPER is into that PACE plan, and you have a plan that's multiple layers deep. The next one is information sharing and interaction with local emergency management. So information sharing, that's the new hot topic these days, but that's a challenge for some in healthcare and also outside of healthcare. A lot of times healthcare gets forgotten about a lot of times. So making sure you have a good relationship with your local emergency management office is imperative. Because remember, anytime that you need a resource request, we always emphasize it always starts at the local emergency manager. Okay, and then it progresses from there, whether it goes to the branch manager of emergency management or area coordinator, branch manager, and healthcare coalition, however far it needs to escalate. But it all starts with the local emergency manager. So that is a very important person for you to be familiar with. All right, some best practices when talking on the radio. We talked about wait until the talk permit tone is complete before you speak. Speak in a normal voice. Microphone a few inches from the mouth. And for the desk set, you can be within 2 feet or so from the desk set when you push that transmit button. If hailing, you do hey you, it's me format. And what that means is, example, Medic 12, this is such and such. Or you can do from Medic 12 from such and such. That is the proper way to hail somebody. If you're unable to copy, please say repeat. And the simple way is just think about plain English. We don't use 10 codes anymore. We're not launching missiles. This is very simple stuff. So if you get confused, plain English and make it short and concise. So anytime we have upward requests over the radio, and let's say your VIPER radio is the only thing working. So generally that flow is going to be what we talked about previously, is who we are. It's going to, we're going to try to make contact with local EM. If not, maybe the healthcare coalition. The next step would be the RCC if it's open during a disaster, and then the state EOC. So there are 2 talk groups in your radio, and they are the NC EOC and one called Statewide Call. And Statewide Call, every 911 center monitors it, or at least is supposed to monitor it in North Carolina. So if you need help and you say, any station monitoring, this is Carteret General Hospital with emergency traffic, somebody's going to answer you. Same thing if you get on the EOC talk group. They have the 24-hour watch, which is a dispatch center at the state EOC, and you can get up there, hail them, and pass your message. The other one is, at least in the eastern part of the state, there's a talk group called EHPC Disaster. It's in the VMN zone. And, that is kind of a hailing talk group for hospitals during a disaster. And if you want more information about that, feel free to reach out to me or your healthcare coalition for more information. All right, another one that comes up is HEMS, Helicopter Emergency Medical Service, Medivac, and helicopters day to day not so bad. When we get into a disaster mode and we have lots of resources in the state, federal resources. Here you see a picture of a MH-60 Jayhawk, which there are currently 3 in North Carolina. At one time during Hurricane Florence, Matthew, we may have 20 to 50 helicopters in North Carolina that are either moving patients, performing rescues. Air operations gets kind of important. So what we want to emphasize, patient reports should be conducted on the VMN hospital channels. They should not be conducted on LZ channels. So LZ channels, which stands for landing zone, that is for air to ground coordination for landing. So a lot of times we're really seeing some of the LZ talk groups abused, where very lengthy patient reports of critical patients are being conducted and flight following. And a majority of these flight services do have their own talk group to maintain communications with the helicopters. So the exception with the VMN channels and patient reports is some hospitals have their own dispatch centers and actually have separate patient call-in talk groups for their helicopters. So there are some exceptions, but overall, VMN, the patient report channel is where you want to do that. If a hospital needs to make contact with a helicopter that's inbound and you can't get up with them, the logical place is going to be the LZ talk group. So for the most part, a lot of the aircraft are monitoring this talk group for the most part. So that's kind of like, if you don't know where to go, I may call their dispatch on the phone, but that's where I'm going to meet them on the radio, is the LZ talk group. Some hospitals may have AM airband radios as a backup. There's been a few projects for those, which is really great. And VIPER works really well up until a point. So flooding events, VIPER's pretty resilient. And even with minor hurricanes, we do get concerned, like a Cat 3 or above hurricane, we do get concerned with VIPER and sometimes some of the backhaul links being degraded. But that being said, these radios here, one, you need a license to use them. Two, generally, people on the ground generally don't use AM airband radios unless you're involved with aviation. So refrain from using these unless it's the last resort. So people get all bent out of shape when ground units start talking on AM air frequencies. So this is good to have in your PACE plan, but this is a last resort. And what you see on the right are pictures of the average radios in the aircraft. Some of the other things, which will be another conversation, is it gets to be a challenge during big disasters on coordinating patient movement. So we may do a module that's specifically on patient movement that hospital emergency managers, ER managers may want to have some visibility on. All right, so we got a glossary of the simple things we discussed today. You're welcome to go back and look at that. And to finish up, if you have any questions, you can reach out. This is Greg Hauser's contact. He's the North Carolina Statewide Interoperability Coordinator, and an excellent gentleman, and he can steer you in the right direction. His job is to ensure we all can talk to each other, we're all trained, and we exercise regularly. And then, of course, if you have questions directed towards this presentation or specific towards healthcare, feel free to reach out to myself. My contact information is here. You can also reach out to your healthcare coalition. They will be happy to help you with any of your questions and get you the resources that you need. So again, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And stay safe out there, and take care.